and welcome to the fourth episode of A Conspiracy on Crime, my forensics podcast. My name is Tegan. I am a senior forensic science major, and today I am joined here with Brenna. We are going to be talking about the Cara Rintala case. So, can you give us a little background on why you're familiar with this case?
Sure. I am one of the original jurors from the first trial back in 2013.
Great. I'm just going to have you kind of give a quick rundown of what you might remember from the case, certain things that stuck out, and then we're going to really kind of go over forensic aspects of the case that I was able to then research. So, can you give us a little background of what you remember?
Sure. I was selected for a jury back in February of 2013. I didn't know anything about the case, so that's part of how I got selected. It was the first same-sex marriage murder trial. Cara Rintala was accused of murdering her wife, Anne-Marie Cochran, in 2010. And there was, it was obviously a local trial, but it was a very big case then in Massachusetts because it was the first of its kind.
With this case, could you just give like a rundown on like maybe the background of the case that you were presented with, or kind of like some of the major points that you remember?
Well, both women were EMTs. The victim, Anne-Marie, was found in her basement, dead, and they had a tumultuous relationship. And the the evidence pointed towards some foul play, maybe accidental and murder, because she was found in her basement. And when the police arrived, Cara was holding her. There's a significant, conspiracy theory about paint that was spilled in the basement, and was that done at the time of the murder versus spilled to cover up evidence. And during the trial, they tried to use that to present us with the idea that Cara had murdered her. During the trial, there was a lot of background that was then provided that the two women had a tumultuous relationship, had background and recordings, police evidence of violence, and a lot of financial issues with Anne-Marie spending, exorbitant amount, tens of thousands worth of debt, not getting along. Although the two were EMTs, their relationship was very challenging. And at that point in their relationship back in 2010, they actually were, I think, separated, but living together because they couldn't afford to live separate, and even had restraining orders against each other. It was very odd and unfortunate.
And there was also a child involved in
They
that?
have a daughter that they had adopted a daughter, and at the time of the murder, I think she was 2 or 3. Yeah.
Now I'm going to kind of talk about some of the forensic evidence, which you've obviously heard in the case. From maybe what it seems, there's a lot of character witness as to the fact that the relationship may have been strained. But there was also, again, you've talked about the paint a little bit and how there may have been some interesting forensic evidence found. And I'm going to kind of talk about what evidence was collected, how it was collected, or how it was not, and how that may have affected the case. The first thing I'll talk about is the paint, because you already kind of brought it up. The paint was found on the basement floor. It was said to have been all over the stairs and the walls, as well as the victim's body, and it was just about a can of paint.
So the paint, the one of the things that was interesting and difficult as a juror to translate and judge when the evidence was presented is the paint itself. It was a 5-gallon bucket of paint, which is a lot. It was ceiling paint, and when they talked about the evidence, um, the characteristic of that paint is that the ceiling paint was white, but when applied, it had a pink hue so that you knew that the paint was wet, and when it dried white. And what was presented when the paramedics and the police arrived is that the paint had a pink hue. And by the time that photographic evidence was presented and then developed, it was very difficult to discern that pink hue in the photographs. For the jurors, it was very difficult to see that. However, also, yes, the paint was everywhere, and it was presented that when the police arrived, that Cara was under Anne Marie and had pulled her onto her body so that there was paint everywhere. Um, and then one of the things that they talked about, which was really difficult for them to completely understand, is the strength of Cara, because Cara is a very small person and Anne Marie was very heavy, and that Anne Marie was in a state like she had been deceased long enough that but she was very heavy and like sort of that dead weight. Sorry.
Yeah.
So for Cara to have been able to manipulate her in the way that she did, it just there's just so much unknown as to how and why. And then if that paint had actually spilled during when they believe the initial confrontation and murder may have happened, that it would have been so many hours prior that it would have been dry or drier.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really just an absolute unknown.
Yeah. And in talking about the paint bucket and whether it had happened if it was an accident and she had fallen down the stairs and died versus foul play being involved, one of the troopers testified that on the basement floor under the bucket of paint, there were bloodstains found, which would then indicate that whatever bodily harm had been done, paint had splattered, and the can had been placed on top of a bloodstain, which means that it would have had to have been moved after being poured or after the harm had been done, which could then indicate that there was a sign of foul play, because if it had been knocked over in an accident, it would have, been tipped on its side. And that may also not have been Cara's first instinct to, pick up the bucket of paint.
And understandably, as a spouse, you go to your spouse, and as an EMT, you're going to try to revive that person. That's your job. That's your initial instinct. But also, once she recognized that she was dead, and again, this was not presented. This was just, I think, multiple jurors' individual thoughts, which we could not use during deliberation, but was discussed, was knowing that, or presuming that she would know to not tamper with evidence.
Right, yeah.
So it's the unanswered question because it was not presented during the trial, but was discussed and then necessarily dismissed during deliberation.
Yeah. And in referring to, her knowledge possibly of, crime scenes, being a first responder, because in any response team, even when you get a phone call and saying somebody is dead, first responders are always supposed to show up just in case there's a way to revive them. So she had likely, responded to many scenes where she either was or was not able to revive an individual. And knowing in doing so that the goal is to not necessarily tamper with the scene, but do whatever you have to do to revive the body first. And then as a forensics major, we are then taught in like the order of how the crime scene goes, and the police respond, and the you know first responders get there, and then we get there. We are actually taught about how to then collect EMT evidence, but you also have the police photographs that should be taken before anyone even steps onto the scene. And one of the things that was also talked about in the case was there bloodstain is a very bloodstain pattern analysis is a huge field. There's many different kinds of patterns that you can make. You have arterial and swipe stains and transfer stains and all this.
And blood splatter.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there were said to have been spatter stains that could be described as blood in flight, which means they have like a tail on them, which can then indicate which direction the blood came from, how fast it was moving, things like that. Someone testified saying that the stains had appeared to have been smeared as if they had been wiped. And they also described multiple transfer stains were found on the shelving, which would indicate, again, the swipe stains would likely mean that often when something dries, it dries from the outside in, the same with paint. So if you were to let it dry for, a minute or two and then wipe it, there would be that ring, and then you would see the swish of the wet blood. And then transfer stains would mean anything that had blood on it that came in contact with anything else, the blood would then be on that object. And those were found on a lot of the shelving, which would also indicate that if Anne Marie had fallen and just, hit her head or something and become unconscious and passed away, she wouldn't have then gotten transfer stains all over a piece of shelving.
Yeah. And also, her the actual cause of death was determined as strangulation, and which then also was presented and indicated that there was, let's say, a fight, and due to the proximity of the basement stairs to the house, that she may have, during the argument, fallen down the stairs, which could have been an accident, but then pursued down into the basement, and a physical altercation continued, which ultimately resulted in her being strangled. With the evidence that was collected and presented, I don't recall the belt or a rope, but something was used to strangle her versus fingers because of the bruising on the body. And that was one of the things that they presented, that with the difference in strength and size of the two women, that Cara would have used some
An additional, yeah.
something else to strangle her, and also knew the length of time in which you had to strangle someone in order for them to actually asphyxiate versus just pass out. Collection of evidence under under Anne Marie's fingernails, things like that. But yes, that there was blood splatter in a variety of places within the basement that absolutely indicated that there was a fight, but also that it appeared that evidence was tried. Somebody had tried to wipe away evidence.
And you talked about the strangulation, and you don't specifically remember whether it was a rope or a belt, which I can't particularly find. They could have possibly described it as the murder weapon in any articles other than what her cause of death was. But that would have been, and it's fine that you don't remember, but that would have been something that forensics would have stepped in and said, because if it had been a rope, which could be very rough and leave that, for me, that would leave a lot of trace evidence, which you could, if any part of a rope had been dislodged in a gouge in her neck or anything, that is something that I would then take to the lab. I would analyze it for trace evidence, and depending on the the color, the thickness, the amount of twists it had in it, I would then be able to, at the very least, create class evidence and determine what kind of brand it was, possibly where it's sold, and then depending on that, if she had bought some, if there was more in the house that you could find somewhere else. A belt would likely be a little bit more difficult depending on whether it was like a flat belt versus like a woven belt, which you would then likely have less of the belt material on her neck, but more so her skin cells on a belt. If you were then, you could, go through her closet and try and see if you could collect any skin cells off of the belt. That would be something that, like, I would look for. If I had seen the bruising on her neck, I would instantly want to find trace evidence or at least swab that area. And I'm not sure if it's in the report or if you heard anything about, you talk about under her fingernails, which is often, I mean, used if there's an altercation to scratch your attacker, but also scratch at your neck. So do you remember if they ever said anything about scratch marks on her own neck?
They did actually. She had scratches on her neck and all of the DNA evidence under her fingernails was from herself. So, because that actually was, I believe, when the defense spoke, they tried to state that the fact that there was no other DNA under the fingernails was an indication that it couldn't, um, we could not without reasonable doubt,
Yeah.
not that it wasn't Cara, but we couldn't determine without reasonable doubt that it was Cara because there was no evidence, there was no DNA of hers. But then again, also the prosecution stating, and the trial was long enough ago that I can't completely remember, but there were um, forensic specialists who then would say that in your defense of trying to survive, you are scratching yourself because you're trying to remove whatever's around your neck. You're not actually going at the attacker, you're going at the whatever's on your neck.
Yeah.
So that also would say that that's a possibility. The prosecution towards Cara was she had left the house for a significant period of time, and she was documented on security cameras at a shopping mall and as well as like fast food restaurants and a grocery store, and that she was seen throwing away something. And when they actually found the evidence that there was um, cloth with blood on it, but by the time they actually started testing, that it had been so long that they weren't able to determine anything conclusively because they had waited so long. And that was one of the other things that during the trial they talked about, that it took them so long to actually arrest her that by the time they actually started testing things, that the DNA was so old, like it was so old that it was that you couldn't, but also that there were other, I'm trying to remember, and now I can't remember what there was something about a shovel that had DNA on it, and then they tried to match some of the wounds on Anne Marie to the edges of the shovel. That was, I remember that in the deliberation room because the shovel was there. And then just all the photographs. So really, I mean, that was just a lot of trying to piece things together that way.
What I researched about the shovel was that it was, yeah, I believe it was found in their garage, so it was not like in the basement by her or anything, but it was said to have had the white paint on it, and the tip of it had been bent, which would indicate, now again, you could be using a shovel for anything and hit a rock, but the bend of the shovel, which you're then saying, they could have tried to match to any wounds on her body, would have been a very good idea, and if they can't find anything, then that's just kind of unfortunate, but also could indicate that it may not have been used, it may have been used for a purpose other than physical harm, if there was still that paint on it. But yes, they did say that they had found that shovel and it had that same paint on it, and a dent at the very tip Another aspect of forensic evidence that was necessarily not done well was one of the defense attorneys had acknowledged and said that there were not proper crime scene procedures taken, which is a huge problem. But he also had said that he and his, fellow forensics team had been taking classes in a certain fingerprint retrievement process, but they did not have the chemicals necessary to complete these processes. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the one, um, because both Tara and Anne Marie were local EMTs, a lot of the people who responded knew them personally, and was mentioned that collection or um, um, not proper protocol was taken at the entrance when they first initially came to the house. So there was potential not tampering but damaging of evidence.
Yeah.
And that yes, when they were taking evidence, they weren't taking it properly. Therefore, the evidence that was collected was not then truly viable for verification
Mhm.
of who the murderer would be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
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 and
for sure.
I think that fingerprinting is not new in by any, DNA evidence is far more recent technology than fingerprinting is. So I'm not sure what chemicals they needed or what this new retrievement was that they were talking about, but you can always dust and collect fingerprints that way.
Hmm.
And then if you found them, but it wasn't a great print or a great lift or anything, you can take things back to the lab. You can do super glue fuming. You can do iodine fuming. There's things like that, which I can't imagine unless you are so severely lacking in certain protocols that you wouldn't have the ability to do one of those procedures.
And
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, again, I mean, 2013 was not that long ago, but it not certainly not to defend them because the case was so incredibly flawed, um, from my perspective, that I don't know in a small town what they had and what they used and what was new to them. I
Hmm.
mean, 2013 seems like it's not that long ago, but it was.
Yeah.
And it's, it's a small town. And after the fact, this was not something that I knew during the trial, but that this was the first murder case in that town in like 30 years. So there's there's a huge protocol that, if you're in a big city or even a larger, town, that they would have more better systems
Yeah.
that they were just used more, unfortunately, because of the more murders per se.
Talking about that and the lack of resources that some places have to say we are kind of just sometimes in the middle of nowhere. We're far from Boston and we're far from New York, and those are probably the two closest areas. There is a state lab in Springfield. So it not to say that, Springfield is necessarily down the street, but and every forensics lab is so overrun and so backlogged that it may not have been the best choice. But do you think that if they believed there to be fingerprint evidence that that's something that they should have done? They should have, because you can send evidence somewhere else if you need certain things done. Do you think that the forensic evidence that they could have gained by sending it out would have been beneficial enough? That was like the least of their concerns.
Absolutely, there were systems that they could have implemented um, sooner, um, to to collect more evidence, or to process more evidence. Um, but I also, again, this would be information that I gathered after the trial, that, um, during and after, that um, it appeared that um, something that continued was that they didn't collect evidence well. Whether that was they just didn't know, or because they were familiar with the individuals who were at the crime scene, um, that it was a lapse in protocol, but then also that they acted on certain evidence sooner. Yes, that they absolutely, we there may have just been more positive, definitive answers, because by the time she was arrested, by the time trial started, um, I mean, the case was so much hearsay. Like, there's no concrete anything. Um, you really just have to, beyond a shadow of a doubt is really
Yeah.
what kept that trial going multiple times.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
And some of the last aspects of forensic evidence involved in the case, or just forensic reports, was that one of the forensic analysts in the case had acknowledged that she had written animal hair apparent cat in her notes, but in her report, which is what you would bring to the trial, so that's what you could refer back to, she wrote animal hair, which I think for a lot of people they wouldn't realize kind of what that is. It's an animal hair. That's what you need to know. It's not human. But in this case, Cara and Anne-Marie did not have a cat, so if it had been determined to be a cat hair, that was something that absolutely needed to be included in the report as well. We were taught that everything needs to be the same everywhere in everything you write, in every report you have, an examination, everything needs to match. So what are your thoughts, or was this ever really spoken about in the case as to the apparent cat hair, or just hair in general in the confines of their home if they did not have an animal or a cat?
Yeah, the cat hair was brought up as another reason for reasonable doubt that there could have been another person in the house. And they brought this back to, so non-forensic aspect, they brought it back to the personal dynamic of the two women, that Anne Marie, the victim, was very, very good friends with a man who was married. But they worked together. So first of all, they worked together. So you spend a lot of time together working, but then they also spent a lot of time together outside of work. He had a cat. So what the defense, no, what what the defense uh, tried to um, use as the not having reasonable doubt was, no one brought this other gentleman to the trial to be a character witness or question that, because whatever this hair was, now Anne Marie and Cara owned a dog, but it was never presented that it could have been dog hair. It was just presented as hair or cat hair. um, that it could have maybe been this other person or somebody else came into the house who owned a cat and transferred a cat hair. Um, but it was also mentioned that Anne Marie and Cara owned a cat a long time ago. So unfortunately, it had to bring up the reasonable doubt, or beyond reasonable doubt. But it seemed to be, as a juror, a very a minor part of the deliberation, but it was still presented.
I do think there's a possibility that it could have played a slightly larger part if they could possibly talk about it more, because with the discrepancies between her notes and her official report, you're talking about how they had a dog, and if she had listed animal hair in her report, the defense or the prosecution could take that and say it could have been a cat, it could have been a dog, it could have been the hair of an animal picked up on the side of the street. But there are ways cat hair and dog hair and mouse hair look incredibly different under a microscope. Very easily able to identify um, that if there had been a more exact answer, which there should have been in the report, that could have cleared things up very easily or not.
It definitely would have given a more definitive role to that aspect of what that could have brought to the whole crime scene and what that meant.
Yeah.
But for the defense, they were certainly trying to use it as a tool to bring doubt to
Yes.
the case. But again, I think personally as a juror, I did not take that because as a juror, you're instructed that you individually have to take each evidence, each witness. You personally bring value and weight to each item. Um, and it definitely could open up cause to have something else presented to the case, um, which was interesting and unfortunate. But I think the the, tra- the documentation was poorly done.
Yeah.
What that brought to the case was a little bit less personally effective, but absolutely, again, the documentation that was completed, what whether consistently or the length of time it took things to be done was just unfortunate.
Yeah. And you saying, the length of time that it took things to be done and how the defense, if it really had been ruled a cat hair in the final report, they could have taken that and run with it, which, to play the non-biased devil's advocate forensic science part, um, we are taught that almost all trace evidence is gone within 4 hours. So, if it had been a cat hair, if I were to play for the side of the defense, I could get up on that stand. I could say that this is a cat hair and it was in their home and they do not have a cat. So that would indicate to me the likelihood that the man, possibly the man, that owned the cat had been in their home within 4 hours of her death. And I could sit there and I could say that, which of course is leaning in one side or the other, but having to be all forensic analysts, you have to be a non-biased source. I could allow the science to point myself to create that doubt within people. I could say and forensic trace evidence can absolutely stay on someone for longer than 4 hours, but we are taught that after 4 hours, the trace evidence becomes less and less because, I mean, think about it. You go outside, maybe it's a really windy day, maybe all these things. Maybe you was wearing a sweatshirt and you took it off and you shook it out, that's really going to affect what stays on that sweatshirt. So I could play devil's advocate on the stand and say that cat hair being in that house could indicate that in the last 4 hours that man or somebody with a cat was present to create that doubt.
Yeah, that was definitely not presented and would have been interesting to hear.
With all of that evidence having been presented, your trial ended.
Our trial ended in a mistrial. Um, and I did actually have to go back. I remember the deliberation taking a very long time. And I did go back and reread. I think we deliberated, it was 3.5 or 4 days, which is a very long time. And even just to try to remember before talking with you, um, we had certain parts of the transcript reread to us, and then the protocol for deliberating on what to take into evidence, what to consider, what you can't consider, and we had that um, presented to us multiple times. And in our deliberation um, room, while it was a hung jury, the the number of jurors of um, believing she was um, guilty versus not guilty did change. I think it started split at 6-6, and then it changed. But with the way that the trial was presented, we had to be unanimous, and there was no way with the forensics evidence that was presented, and even possibility that she could be convicted with what was presented versus what we ourselves during the deliberation thought of and then said, "Oh, we can't use that because that's what we did." The evidence that was presented was not enough.
Now, she was tried 4 times, and um, she had a hung jury for 3 of them. And on the fourth trial, which happened in the fall of 2022, she was found guilty of manslaughter. So, what are your thoughts on that ruling, and what was the sentencing that the jury had to deliberate on in your case?
That's actually a great question, and I think part of when she was finally convicted, I know that in the first 2 trials, she was tried in murder in the first degree, which has, again, very, very specific parameters for murder. Where when she was finally convicted, it was manslaughter, which has also just a very different classification and qualification for death. And I think that if there had been an option to convict her in something other than murder in the first degree, um, it would have been there's a good chance that um, the conviction would have happened sooner. Even if it wasn't in the first trial, that in the second, maybe. I do know that the prosecution was really, really adamant that they wanted a murder in the first degree. And that was basically an intent to kill.
Murder in the first degree and the second degree really changes dependent on how premeditated it was, whether it was like a planned thing. I mean, and people talk about she had gone to the mall with her daughter, and she had gone to McDonald's with her daughter, and she had kind of made a few interesting stops before and maybe after the death, and how that played into it. But that it for murder in the first and the second has to do with how premeditated it was, and then you drop down to manslaughter.
There was no more, I understand, there was no more evidence presented in each trial. Each trial was, certainly the first trial and the second trial, because I did pay attention to the second trial when it happened, because during the first trial, I did not listen to any media at all. And I will say this as a juror, in our case, while while our legal system is very flawed, each one of us, I was just in awe at how seriously we took it and how important it was. And you can see going from trial to trial how different it can be because you have different personalities and different backgrounds and different beliefs. But knowing the parameters, what is murder in the first versus murder in the second versus manslaughter, and having the same evidence presented year after year after year, that there was a stronger ability to convict with a lesser sentence.
You've talked about, I mean, this is a small area, a lot of small towns that bleed into each other quite a bit. A lot of people know each other. And you've already talked about how she was a paramedic, so the people that went to her house knew who she was. How do you think that also played into possibly the jury selection and in the deliberation room? What do you think are like the aspects of, everybody's human and everyone brings their own insight, and you all may have had one connection or another?
So when jury selection was interesting, having not, I had been called for jury a couple of times and sat in a room, read a book for 4 hours, and was dismissed. Um, so this selection, it was interesting. I don't know if this is the way it normally goes or how, but everyone that was called to jury Judy that day. We all literally walked into the courtroom and sat in the pews, and there were, I don't know, 50 or 60 of us. We read a bunch of notes like, um, does anybody is anybody a relative of a police officer or a paramedic in this area? And they were dismissed. Does anybody have a bias against same-sex marriage? That was a big one because, of course, that was one of the biggest things with this case. So, if there was anybody that had any issue with same-sex relationships, does anybody know anybody who is a victim of domestic violence?
Mm-hmm.
So the initial questions that they were all asking were, can you separate yourself from that aspect of the trial? So there were people who knew somebody who had been killed or was a domestic violence survivor, detectives or police officers or paramedics, if you knew who they were in a social setting because they were going to be testifying, that might give you a bias. So there were a lot of people actually that were dismissed for that. But then it was very interesting. They just, they said, are you willing to be neutral and not take anything that is presented on a personal level, and only take the evidence as it is said, and then truly interpret it to the best of your ability. So that was pretty. It was a pretty interesting day.
Do you think, although it's unfortunate that it was a hung jury 3 times, do you think that the prosecution and defense did what they needed to do in dismissing the right people? And do you think that you as a jury did the best of your ability and spoke for as long as you could before coming to the conclusion of a hung jury? Because that is not an easy conclusion to come to.
Having it be a hung jury, to me, um, indicates that the prosecution did not do their job to the best of the jurors' ability to make a conclusive decision, because it is the prosecution's job. And that was something that was actually presented. The defense attorney, his I almost feel, trying to remember the case, but his whole presentation of his side of the case was, I don't have to do anything except tell you that the prosecution is not going to be able to present to you without a reasonable doubt that this is the person. And ultimately, that is what happened. The prosecution, with the evidence that was presented in the trial that we could use to determine guilt, was not sufficient. In deliberation, we came up with our own theories and thoughts and potential conclusions that, had we been able to use that, may have changed to a unanimous decision. Um, and and the fact that it took us days and days and days, and this is not 8, 9 hours in a room with 12 people, with physical evidence on a table, photographs of a human being, and we actually went to the house and went to the area where she was found to use all of that. I think each person, while we were not to share much about who we were individually, we all had very various backgrounds, to really be able to speak up for ourselves individually, and use our voices and talk, and try to explain our views, and then take our personal views of what was presented and really turn it into just what the evidence was. It was a pretty incredible experience. It was a heartbreaking experience to go through, um, and ultimately, unfortunately, with what the prosecution had for evidence um, to present with the murder in the first, it couldn't be um, definitive. It couldn't be unanimous.
Yeah.
And I do believe that in the continuing with the trial, that is why they changed the choice of prosecution to manslaughter.
I think it's very interesting to hear about how you all, in the end, obviously remained, fact based, and you used obviously what you were allowed to. But it's interesting to hear that even in within a jury, you as human beings, you naturally try and tell a story. The whole point of a jury though is that you're all lay individuals, and you can't read the forensic evidence the way that I can. But then my job being on trial is I have to present it to you in a way that you can understand and use it to the best of your abilities. But a lot of all my other episodes have been about how media can manipulate one theory or another theory and make people conspire and pick sides. People, they pick sides, and some of those scenarios can cause people. I mean, the John Benet Ramsey case was huge, and it divided the people that believed who did what. But hearing that even on a slightly smaller scale, because there's only 12 of you involved, that still exists, and thought process can exist even when you guys are like not allowed to view media. You still have your own thoughts and opinions.
I think since the trial and sort of whenever I now when I listen to news and stuff like that, something that I take out of it is um, the dramatization that is brought to newsworthy events is unfortunate. And I think the difference in kind of what you're saying and what I'm hearing too is that in the collection of evidence that we were presented with, and as you're talking about how evidence is collected and the forensic background of it's making me remember so much that I actually have worked really hard to forget because it was very hard. Being on a jury and being one of 12 people that is going to decide whether somebody goes to jail for the rest of their life for murdering somebody is something that I think that most people, but I took so painfully seriously. It was very, very hard. That was a very hard time. And it was like 3.5, 4 weeks. It was a long time to be in that and submersed in it. But for us, I'm thinking about looking at the photograph of the handprint on the wall on the stairs that was the blood smear, or the corner of the stair at the bottom of the stair, and the photograph of Anne Marie in the back of her head, and the 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 90-degree angled wound on the back of her head that I interpreted and recognized was the exact same shape as the corner of the stair, but forensically and prosecution wise was never presented that matched this. That this wound on her head matched the corner of the stair, and how would that have happened? So the person that took those photographs, I can go, oh my gosh, this matches this, but no one said it in the trial, so I believe that, but it was never presented. So I have to take my interpretation and thought about that and push it aside and only take into evidence what the prosecution said. And I think that all of the jurors did that. And I think that's why, even though we were a hung jury, the the numbers changed. We deliberated and we voted many times, and the number changed each time. And I think that that just says something about the importance of collection and when you don't process evidence quickly enough, that you lose the ability to collect. Or I know that they had blood on a cloth, but by the time they collected it, it had denatured enough that it wasn't conclusive. So there's just, so there's that flaw. So, and we'll never know. But it really, as a juror, I think that we, in that case, really took all of the evidence and analyzed it through what the prosecution had presented.
To wrap things up, you talked about how hard this case was and how you were on a jury and you were going to decide the fate of this woman. And I think that the same way that you decide is the same way that to talk about how important my role as a forensic analyst would be to collect the evidence, test it, preserve it as well as possible, and then present it to the best of my abilities. And how if I were to present something poorly, that would then change your opinion, changing the case. Because you've had that experience that most people have not had. How do you think the dramatization, the obsession with crime shows, true crime podcasts, and how that affects my career and could later trickle down into who's in my career, who may be presenting on a stand, and who may be interpreting that evidence?
Wow. Okay. I think that there are some, when it's more factually based, some of the documentaries are really, really well done from we'll call it maybe a historical aspect. If we use, oh my gosh, I'm going to use like Jeffrey Dahmer, and I kind of like how an individual presents themselves to the world. And then when you find out that there's this underlying person and persona and secret, and then things kind of seep out and you go, oh, I didn't realize. So it's presented in a much more informational way versus sensationalized. Okay. So I just watched, because we were talking about it, because you're talking about all this information.
But Jeffrey Dahmer was season 1 of that show.
Right. So I haven't, and then the Menendez brothers was one. So I just watched the Ed Gein one.
Yeah.
And as I'm watching it, I actually then started Google researching him. What they did in the documentary, which was interesting once I researched it, was who he was and how his actions formed and created the sensationalism of the movie industry and the media and the serial killers who came after him. And what the documentary did was loop it kind of all into one. So it dramatized it. To me, it was a little frustrating because what I then did was research and go, oh my gosh, that's actually interesting. But a lot of people are like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Like, it's cool versus interesting. I think that for you in your career, the ability to present evidence as neutral and as factual as possible is key. To be able to say that I collected DNA evidence under the fingernails of a victim that doesn't show evidence of the murderer is normal. That wasn't presented in my case. So I didn't know that until after the fact. Right? That's not reality.
Yeah.
And I know that, and not many people do. I think as someone who is in forensic science and someone whose job and interest is to collect and preserve evidence for someone to bring peace and finality to a situation, is so important, and taking that so seriously is really important.
Yeah. With how important that is, um, you saying that you watched the Ed Gein season of Monsters almost correct you is that you're calling it a documentary and it provides there are so many films and shows that are not documentaries that are presented like documentaries that are bluntly false, right? Nobody knows what was said during a shopping spree. They just know that they purchased these things, and you see the shopping spree. Like that's filmed. It's them sitting on couches in luxury Rolex stores and trying on designer suits and posing for each other, and people are like, "Oh wow, they just killed their parents and they're just hopping around."
But you're saying that that's the film version.
The film version. No, we know that they went into these stores and they purchased these things. They could have done that in silence.
Right.
They could have done that separately. They might have gone together. You don't know how it's done, and then but people view the Ted Bundy movie and the act and all these things like those are the truth.
Right.
And I'm very glad that people are very passionate about forensics. There's a huge, uprise in the interest of it. But do you think that that possibly means that, like, 5 to 10 years in the future, who is going to be working in this field because they liked the Jeffrey Dahmer series or things like that? Because I will also say that I think that in 4 years of schooling and 17 chemistry classes later, you do wean out the people who don't want to sit in the lab for the rest of their life. But do you think that that passion may pull people in not the best direction, and to maybe know that 10 years from now, the forensic expert on that stand could be a big fan of Criminal Minds?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess anything is possible would be the answer. Would be part of it, but also to what you also then just said, someone is going to say, "Oh, this is cool," and then they're going to take their first chemistry class, and they're going to go, "Oh my God, this is horrible," and they're not. So I think that, as you said, those people who like the dramatization and think that it's cool and fun are going to learn really quickly how hard it is, and because it's science. I mean, it's like up there with doctorate work. Um, you're just doing it on the other side. Maybe a positive spin would be that it's more out in the open, the knowledge of the history, and that not all things are as they seem. But then also taking this as um, social drama and interest and profession, if you kind of tie them all together and then you bring it back to my experience as a juror, one of the things that is brought to the jurors is you individually have to make the determination if the person on the stand is believable. The prosecution is going to have a forensics expert, and the defense is going to have a forensics expert, and they're not going to say the same thing because it's their job is to make you believe that the evidence presented leans towards the guilt of the individual, and the defense's forensics expert is to present the evidence in a way that's going to make you doubt. So you have to believe that person. But I think that, again, as a forensics major, as someone who is in this system, what you do and how you interpret and how you model yourself or the case um, will show in your work and how detailed you are, because each individual or each case that you work on, what you do matters so much for the final outcome of whatever that situation was.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking with me and talking about this case and all that you've experienced.
You're welcome. Happy to.
It was great to have you.